Probably one of the most misunderstood philosophers of all time, Friedrich Nietzsche has a lot of very interesting thoughts that have been passed down along history, many of which are pulled together in his most famous book here, which I read a while ago, and I would like to dissect some of his most compelling thoughts and arguments and try to apply them to our world. But also keep in mind, as I'm saying these, Nietzsche lived a very isolated life, and nobody bought any of his books or ideas until after he was dead. And his unorthodox view on truth that challenges most people's beliefs, including my own, is partly the reason what makes him so interesting to read. Every chapter of this book is pretty much just a new perspective on his philosophy that we can interpret, but also his perspective on life. The first thing Nietzsche talks about is the idea of how all philosophers, what they really do is just write about their own assumptions, beliefs, and prejudices. And he says that the work of a philosopher is a projection of their own thoughts. But I mean, isn't that what really any piece of literature is? Isn't that what this YouTube video is? It's just me giving my own thoughts and you thinking it's interesting enough to listen to and keep watching. However, Nietzsche is both skeptical of language and truth, those ideas, because they're kind of described in a fixed factual way. He says that words can't fully describe thoughts, since our thoughts flow and change as the universe changes. Obviously, entropy, that's law of thermodynamics, proves this, but words, when you write them down, cannot change. You can't change them once they've written down. They have a kind of meaning. But this is also a part I disagree with him, because words can have a different meaning depending on the reader. They can have a very fluid motion as well. But the idea is that Nietzsche disagrees with how most philosophers view things as as ideas to be writing theorems on and to be writing rules about. That's really what science is, you know? And he says that our idea of truth, morality, and God come from this fixed description of the universe, which he calls false. Nietzsche disagrees with a lot of what traditional philosophy says, and he shows us that the concept of good and evil can be different depending on different scenarios and different people. But I see a couple of problems with this, and as I mentioned earlier, science is kind of us trying to describe the complex universe in terms of simple terms, as that allows us to better understand the universe and better appreciate our own existence, really. We have laws to protect our society for a reason. They are fixed things. You know, fixed things do have a place. I mean, isn't his very book filled with words that are fixed? The will to power is probably one of his most important ideas, as it describes our kind of subconscious voice that drives us towards freedom and conquering and dominating and winning and doing cool things, you know, with our lives. Nietzsche recognizes that we have some kind of desire within us that motivates us towards accomplishing our goals and dreams. And obviously, we all know there's a biological reason to survive and reproduce. But once you reach the top of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, in order to self-actualize, you need the motivation towards accomplishing your goals. What this looks like in practice is becoming successful in our society, defined by, I would say, probably a weighted average of being rich, attractive looking, having social connections, being famous. And these are all things that you need your own will to power to help you put in the effort. The late nights, early mornings to achieve difficult things. That's really the end of the day what people find successful, and what he defines as achieving difficult things. However, Nietzsche applies this kind of will to power a bit differently than what I'm doing now. He says that because facts and fixed things depend on their meaning, and the meaning constantly changes, there is no correct thing such as an absolute or correct viewpoint. That shows his nihilism there, right there. He believes that every viewpoint is the expression of some will or another, including that one. But rather than try to talk truth, we should try to remain as flexible as possible, looking at matters from different perspectives at all. He has an idea of the philosophy of the future, which is one that is kind of moving and changing with time and free to change perspectives and overturn other truths and ideas we previously believed were true. The moral ideas of good and evil, in this sense, don't have an inherent meaning, and they're just things we use. And thus, Nietzsche wants to move beyond good and evil, just so that philosophers use their own will to power inward, and then they struggle, and through struggling, they overcome themselves and their own egos, assumptions, prejudices, and ultimately become the best version of itself. That's just the fancy way of him applying the will to power. I mean, which makes sense, like, especially his morality argument. It's really hard to say whether something someone did is morally correct or not, whether something did is good or evil, without like a religious kind of thing to back it off of, whether it be the Bible or the Torah, the Quran, or any other scripture. I mean, the Constitution of the United States here was founded on Christian theological beliefs. God is referenced in the Constitution for a reason, because the founding fathers needed a objective way to determine things like saying things like, if murder is wrong, that goes against one of the, commandments of the Bible. And in order to objectively say something like that and make laws, you need a reference for that. And Nietzsche is saying that there is no reference. And that's his nihilism coming out again. Somewhere in the middle of the book, Nietzsche tells us the insights he's gained on life with a bunch of quotes. And I think some of them are pretty interesting. Now, if you read all of them, some of them are kind of weird, but I'm going to tell you the ones that are not weird, Under the conditions of peace, the warlike man attacks himself. And I would say it's so that the warlike man doesn't become weak through skipping his training. As we all know, there's a saying that strong men are created by bad times, and good times create weak men. So in order to keep yourself strong during the good times, you have to kind of train yourself and keep training and don't stop your training, A soul which knows it is loved but does not itself love betrays its dregs, its lowest part comes out. If you don't love others, then ultimately I feel like you're betraying the love of the people who loved you first. And if you are loved at first, it's kind of an obligation of yours, as Nietzsche says, to share that love with others. What? A great man? I only see the actor of his own ideal. Any successful person you see really just work towards their ideal every single day for years and often decades to get close to it as possible towards their dream. Thus, you see them as actors of their own ideals. And he who does not know how to find the road to his ideal lives more frivolously and impudently than the man with an ideal. I mean, that makes sense. Someone without goals and ideals is going to live more comfortable than someone who tries and trudges through the path towards their goals. But through discomfort, that second person is going to reap more rewards, and I feel like is just going to get more out of life than the first person. Like, nobody starts life knowing exactly what to do, and a necessary part of becoming successful is going through the journey to find the path towards your goals. The will to overcome an emotion is ultimately only the will of another emotion or several others. To go through pain and suffering, which honestly is most of life, you need the combination of multiple emotions to get you through it, such as motivation, desire, vision for yourself, love, and seeing how much better you are at the destination than when you are right now. That is going to push you towards that discomfort. He who fights with monsters should look into it that he himself does not become a monster. And when you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss gazes back at you. I mean, that's just Geralt of Rivia Witcher stuff right there. But in actual real life, I feel like a lot of professions in the legal system, especially towards criminal cases, I guess police officers, lawyers, attorneys, they need to be careful not to, become the villain.
You either die a hero or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain.
Harvey Dent was a freaking lawyer. Oh my God. That which is done out of love always takes place beyond good and evil. I mean, love and emotions are never objective. We know that. They're just opinions. But Nietzsche comments how this is kind of a part of us, a part of humans, Whether this is a bug or a feature or something that we should get rid of, you depend on who you ask. I don't know the answer to that, but what we do know is that emotions and love is something that is a part of us that we need to deal with and recognize. Madness is something rare in individuals, but in groups, parties, people, and ages, it is the rule. This is just the psychological idea of groupthink, where people tend to form collective beliefs, even if it doesn't represent their own belief. Even if they don't agree with it themselves, they want to agree with the group to feel, respected, to feel like they're part of something. But it's also up to the individual to speak out against it when these groupthink beliefs can go wrong, just to make sure they don't become dangerous. And, create things like the Holocaust and create bad events because of that. The strongest people are marked by a cruelty to themselves, according to which they mercilessly expose their prejudice and assumption in order to dig more deeply into themselves. Self-reflection and meditation is something that I feel like is really important nowadays. You see it pushed. So many apps are coming out that help you guided meditation. And I would say that is partly how you help focus your mind, but going to the gym is an example of you going and purposely punishing yourself and your body. But you punish yourself and your body knowing that you're going to grow from it. As when a child gets punished, I hope they're going to learn from it. I guess that's the point of that. Now on to probably Nietzsche's most controversial idea, slave morality. His idea is basically that most people conform to what their neighbor's doing out of comfort and knowing that they're not going to be mocked for being different, which creates the herd. And as he numerically defines it, it's the 80% of the people that kind of follow the top 20%, which are going to be the masters. In Nietzsche's definition of the herd, the people in the herd despise the strong because they feel themselves weaker, and therefore attack the strong's achievements with slander and say that being weak is a virtue, because humility. Nietzsche also says that especially the masses often eradicate any sense of individualism and starts creating an egalitarian and declining nightmare, which he specifically saw with his Western European society that he lived in the late 1880s. But I feel like there are some shocking similarities to our own world in 2022. But I think this has more to do with the fact that being strong takes in a lot of effort most people are not willing to put in. Our world is designed in so that there are many, many ways that you can become distracted so you don't put in the work, so therefore you become part of the herd. And, we all need to ultimately become our own parents to make sure we consistently put in the work and check in on ourselves. In Nietzsche's definition, good and evil can mean different things for the master and for the herd. For the master, strength is something that's good because it's virtuous. It helps them. For the herd, weakness is virtue because it shows humility, and it kind of creates a victimhood industrial complex that they follow to make themselves feel better. Again, I don't agree with all of this, but one thing I do agree with is that Nietzsche says that the best master is the one that most followers in the herd want to follow. Which makes sense because you want to follow good leaders, and that noble men especially create their own values. And part of the values of the masters is that they should avoid things that harm themselves. Again, there are a lot of problems with this. The world is not black and white, obviously, and I think what often happens is that people tend to cycle between being masters of themselves, being masters of others, but also being part of the herd sometimes. And I think there's kind of a back and forth cycle that goes past equilibrium. It just never reaches equilibrium because that's not a thing. And I think Nietzsche is really ultimately trying to find what it means to be a leader versus a follower. But seeing this rigid and kind of binary way of viewing people, it's not going to make you a leader. I'm a computer science major. I see things in binary sometimes, and it leads me into bad places. Don't see the world as that. The world is gray, and that's what literature and philosophy reveals to us. You have to have your followers trust you in order to gain respect as a leader. And empathy is a really important part of that, which I think Nietzsche is kind of going the opposite way of empathy by kind of dividing the world into two types of people, which I don't think is true. Nietzsche believed that ultimately the purpose of humans is that we're the bridge between the animals and what's known as the Übermensch. We are not ends in ourselves, but a means, he says, a bow that must be bent in order to shoot for the Übermensch, our ultimate ideal, our goal of the ideal person. It takes effort to bend the bow for us to become our ideal person. And that's effort is what 80% of people in the herd are not willing to put in, unfortunately, but is required to do so. And Nietzsche he loves the idea of rising above things, especially rising above society structures and creating your own rules. Nietzsche is probably the best definition of a Sigma male. He believed that a good European in his times is one that rises above nationalism to find their own identity. And part of becoming an Übermensch is being a person who strives for something great, and you regard everyone you talk to and meet as either a delay or a hindrance towards your goals, or as a possible temporary resting place. He says that the loftiness towards his fellow men, which is proper to him, becomes possible only when he has reached his height and he rules, aka the person has achieved success and becomes the Übermensch. Impatience and his consciousness until that time he is condemned to comedy, aka people treat you as a clown and don't treat you seriously until you have big achievements that you've done through your will to power. See, everything connects here. And ultimately, the Übermensch is kind of this idea of the ideal self that we all want to reach towards, which we need the will to power to get us there. We also need to realize that view things as kind of changing and adapting towards that, as we said in the beginning of his philosophy, in order for the Übermensch to kind of even raise above the masters of humans. Another interesting thing that Nietzsche mentions is that every profound thinker is more afraid of being understood than being misunderstood. The latter may perhaps wound his vanity, but the former will wound his heart. It kind of makes sense, like if you're talking with someone who's like outside of your own field of study, but then they start to understand what you're studying and what you're doing, that kind of adds a sense of accountability that adds anxiety towards you. I know I've experienced this in college when I've talked to some people in different majors who actually know maybe even more than me about my own thing, and that creates a lot of uncertainty. And obviously Nietzsche doesn't mind being misunderstood. And ultimately Nietzsche's idea of nobility is a solitary and suffering soul who has risen far above the rabble to be unrecognizable and totally misunderstood by everyone else. And he closes the book with a poem about a noble soul sitting on top of a mountaintop wishing he had more friends, pretty much. He preaches that, eagles must fly alone. But again, I see another black and white argument fallacy being made here. He sees solitude as a virtue because it provides cleanliness and peace of mind, because man and society and the big cities are inherently messy. And while I think it's important to spend some periods of time alone, reflecting on yourself, spending all of your time in isolation is not a good idea, not a good way to come up with ideas, as you need to speak to people about them in order to see if they're good or not. While I do agree solitude does provide you focus, you also have to share your work for it to have impact. I think my time that I spent in COVID lockdowns proves this argument wrong, as I felt as uncreative as ever when I spent the kind of weeks and months not with my friends, not seeing anyone. And I think that in order to come up with good ideas and achieve great things, you need to cycle periods of isolation with socializing, just so that you can receive feedback on your work, your goals, and yourself. That way, you can ultimately start working towards becoming the Übermensch.